Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing to prove. The ones who act like they don't care, those are the ones you never see coming. Not because they're cold, but because they've outgrown the need to be seen. When I was younger, I used to walk into rooms with this invisible checklist pinned to my heart. Be liked, be impressive, be approved, be enough. And I didn't even realize I was carrying it. It was just there, quietly steering my every decision, my every conversation, my every relationship. I thought that if I could just check all the boxes, if I could be agreeable enough, kind enough, successful enough, I could finally earn a seat at the table. I would bend, I would twist, I would shrink, I would study the people around me like I was preparing for a final exam, figuring out what version of me they wanted and becoming her. Fast. But here's the thing about shape-shifting to earn acceptance. You don't actually get accepted, you just get tolerated. They don't love you, they love the costume. They love the version of you that doesn't take up too much space. And over time, you become so addicted to their approval that you start to think it's who you are. You stop asking, do I like this person? And you start asking, do they like me? I remember chasing people who were already halfway out the door. I remember texting first, apologizing for things that weren't my fault, losing sleep, wondering if I said too much or not enough. I remember fighting so hard to be understood by people who had already decided they didn't want to understand me. And then one day, I just got tired. There wasn't some grand epiphany, no fireworks, no dramatic ending. I was just sitting with myself, utterly exhausted from the performance. And this quiet question bubbled up inside me. What if I stopped caring about proving myself? What if I stopped begging people to see me? What if I let go? What would actually happen if I walked into a room and didn't worry about being liked? If I just focused on liking myself? I realized I wasn't afraid of being disliked. I was afraid of being invisible. I was afraid that if I wasn't impressive, I wouldn't matter. That if I stopped performing, I'd disappear. But here's the brutal truth. When you constantly care what people think, you give them silent permission to control you. You hand over the script of your life and ask them to write your story. Psychologists have a name for this. It's called external validation dependence. It's when your entire sense of self is built on someone else's applause. And the tragedy is that you can spend years living in someone else's cage, never realizing you hold the key. When I stopped chasing their approval, something radical happened. I started attracting people who saw me without the costume. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds about me. I stopped begging for seats at tables where the price of admission was my authenticity. Letting go didn't make me cold, it made me free. It made me powerful in a quiet, grounded way. It taught me that the most magnetic people aren't the ones screaming for attention, they're the ones who no longer need it. The moment you stop chasing, you start attracting. That's not a cute quote, it's a soul truth. Because when you finally decide that you are enough without their approval, you stop shrinking to fit places you were never meant to stay. I once found myself pouring everything I had into a relationship that quietly, slowly drained the life out of me. I was constantly adjusting myself, trying to be easier to love, easier to keep, easier to stay with. I would overthink every text, analyze every silence, rehearse conversations in my head before I dared to speak them aloud. I kept telling myself, if I just do more, if I just try harder, they'll stay. They'll choose me. They'll see me. But here's the part no one really tells you. Sometimes people leave, no matter how much you give. Sometimes, no matter how beautifully you show up, no matter how carefully you love, people will still walk away. And when they do, you're left standing in the debris of everything you tried to hold together, wondering why it wasn't enough. For a long time, I thought I was abandoned because I wasn't good enough. But eventually, I realized the opposite was true. I was abandoned because I was doing too much for someone who never intended to meet me halfway. I thought that giving more would make me indispensable. I thought that sacrificing my own peace would earn me their loyalty. But people don't stay because you abandon yourself for them. People stay because they want to. And the ones who need you to twist yourself to be loved are not the ones who will ever offer you safe belonging. The truth is, when you care too much about holding on to someone who keeps letting you go, you start bleeding yourself dry in silence. And the more you care, the more power you hand over to someone who was never built to carry it responsibly. Psychology has a name for this too. It's called anxious attachment. It's this painful cycle where you keep clinging tighter the more distant someone becomes, thinking your effort can fix their disinterest. But what's actually happening is this: you're asking someone else to fill a hole inside you that only you can heal. There's a quiet strength in learning to detach, not from love, not from compassion, but from the outcome. It's about learning to hold people with open hands instead of clenched fists. It's about being able to say, "I love you, but I will not betray myself to keep you. I care, but I will not abandon my own peace to earn your attention." Acting like you don't care is not about building walls. It's about building boundaries. It's about realizing that your worth cannot survive being on life support, hooked up to the approval of someone who only gives you just enough to keep you waiting. I used to think that caring deeply meant holding on no matter what. But now I know it means knowing when to let go. It means knowing when your heart is being asked to bleed for someone who's not even reaching for a bandage. It means I learned, painfully, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to step back, to stop fighting for a place in someone's life when the door is already closed. That's not indifference, that's wisdom. That self-respect stitched back together from all the places you once tore yourself apart to make room for someone else. The armor of detachment isn't coldness, it's survival. It's walking away with your soul intact. It's saying, I can love you, and I can also leave you if loving you means losing me. And when you learn that, you don't just protect your heart, you finally start to heal it. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose people to finally find yourself. And that's not weakness, that's the quietest kind of power. There was a season in my life when I believed that if I could just find the right words, if I could just explain myself perfectly, I could make people stay. I could make them understand. I could earn their kindness. I would rehearse conversations in my head over and over, trying to craft the perfect sentences, the perfect explanations, the perfect defenses for why I deserved to be treated well. I used to think that if people walked away, it was because I had failed to communicate my heart well enough. I thought maybe if I had explained it one more time, softened my tone a little more, made myself a little smaller, maybe they would have heard me. Maybe they would have stayed. Maybe they would have finally seen me. So I would talk and talk and talk. I would try to fill the silence with evidence of my worth. I would plead for understanding, offer every detail, every piece of my story like a lawyer begging for mercy in a courtroom. But here's the brutal truth I ran into face earth. People hear what they want to hear. People see what they choose to see. And sometimes, no amount of explanation will make a difference to a heart that has already decided you don't matter enough. I learned that no matter how carefully you craft your words, they will always land on the soil they choose. And sometimes that soil is so dry, so cracked, that nothing you plant will ever grow there. Not because you are not enough, but because their ground was never fertile to begin with. And one day, in the middle of another exhausting conversation, where I was over-explaining myself to someone who wasn't even trying to understand me, something inside me just stopped. It just stopped. I got quiet, and in that silence, I heard something I had never really heard before. Me, that silence. It wasn't defeat, it was revelation. In psychology, they call this emotional withdrawal. It's the moment you stop pouring energy into a space that no longer holds it with care. It's when your nervous system finally stops firing and your body realizes the fight is over. Not because you lost, but because you've decided it's not worth the war. And you know what happens next? Your silence starts to echo louder than all the noise you ever made. Your absence speaks volumes they never expected to hear. Your lack of explanation becomes the boldest, clearest boundary you've ever set. There's this strange thing that happens when you stop chasing people's understanding. They suddenly notice your absence. They suddenly wonder why you're no longer trying to prove yourself. They notice that the story they were so used to dismissing now sits in the room quietly, without apology, without performance. But by then, you've moved on. By then, you're not interested in being heard by someone who only ever listened to themselves. The silence I once feared became the silence I now protect, because silence is where I reclaim my peace. Silence is where I stop hemorrhaging my energy for people who were never really listening. There's a power in saying nothing. There's power in stepping back, in choosing to let people sit with the discomfort of your absence, and letting them feel the quiet weight of the space you used to fill. When you no longer need to explain yourself, you are free. When you can sit in your own silence without rushing to fill it, you've stepped into a power no performance can touch. Psychologists call it strategic detachment. I call it sacred self-respect, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away without slamming the door, without raising your voice, without burning the bridge. Just walk away. Quietly, calmly, completely. The loudest message you'll ever send is the one wrapped in your silence. And the people who were meant to hear it, they always do. There's a very particular kind of heartbreak that comes from standing in front of someone you desperately wanted to stay, someone you thought would be part of your forever, and realizing they're perfectly fine without you. I've stood there. I've stood right in that quiet ache, face to face with someone who was already emotionally gone, but too polite, or too comfortable, or too indifferent to admit it. I remember the knot in my stomach, the desperate urge to say something, anything, that would make them care again. I remember the temptation to fight, to beg, to prove I was worth the effort. There's this lie that sneaks into your head in those moments that says, if you don't fight for this, you're giving up. If you don't fight, you didn't love enough. So I almost fought. I almost reached for them. I almost launched into another long speech about how much I had given, how much I had stayed, how much I had cared. But then something inside me, something quiet and fierce, whispered, no, not this time. Not for them. Not at the cost of you. I turned around. I walked away. I didn't say another word. And it was the loudest thing I've ever done. The courage it takes to walk away without trying to fix it is not the kind of courage people clap for. It's not the courage that gets celebrated in movies or songs. It's the quiet, trembling courage that happens when you decide to stop explaining yourself to someone who's already decided they're done listening. It's the courage to realize that some people only stay if you keep performing, if you keep begging, if you keep shrinking to fit their comfort. And sometimes you have to be willing to disappoint those people. You have to be willing to let the door close. You have to be willing to be the villain in their story, if it means being the hero in your own. We live in a world that glorifies fighting for things, but not nearly enough people talk about the bravery required to not fight, to not chase, to not invest your energy into battles where winning means losing yourself. Psychologists call this radical acceptance. The ability to accept people and situations exactly as they are, not as you wish they would be. It's a form of emotional maturity that says, I don't have to like this, I don't have to agree with this, but I accept that this is where you are, and I will no longer spend my life hoping you become someone else. When you reach this place, you start to understand what it really means to act like you don't care, not because you've become numb, but because you finally recognize that some battles aren't yours to fight. I once thought that being indifferent meant being cold-hearted, but now I see it clearly. Indifference is sometimes the bravest thing you can embody. It's the refusal to hand your emotions to someone who's already shown they won't handle them with care. It's the courage to say, I release you. I release the story I built about us. I release the version of me that only existed to make you comfortable. Sometimes the boldest move is to simply not show up for the fight they expected you to beg to be part of. Sometimes the quietest strength is found in your ability to walk away without needing to be right, without needing to be chosen, without needing to be validated. You become dangerous in the best way when you no longer require anyone's permission to protect your peace. You become powerful when you can say, I choose me, even if that means you choose to leave. Sometimes the boldest move is to simply not show up for the fight they expected you to beg to be part of. And when you do that, they won't see you coming. Because you're not coming at all, you've already left. There was a time when I craved to be seen, not just noticed, but seen. I wanted people to understand my heart, to validate my efforts, to witness my becoming. I used to measure my worth by how many people clapped when I succeeded, how many people reached out when I was quiet, how many people chose me when there were other options. I wanted to shine in their eyes, and if I'm being painfully honest, I wanted them to say it. I wanted them to say, you're important, you matter, I see you. It's human, isn't it? We grow up learning to chase gold stars and applause and recognition. We build our self-worth like a house made of other people's opinions, believing that if we can just get enough people to approve of us, we'll finally be safe. We'll finally be enough. So I spent years trying to get it right, trying to be impressive, trying to be unmissable, trying to prove that I belonged under the spotlight. But here's what no one really tells you. When you build your life on the need to be seen, you become addicted to attention. And the moment people stop clapping, you start collapsing. You start wondering, what am I without their approval? What am I if no one's watching? You start performing instead of living. You start chasing the next big thing, the next applause, the next round of validation, because you're terrified that if you fade into the background, you'll somehow disappear altogether. I remember the exact moment I realized I was exhausted. I was sitting alone after a big achievement, one I had fought for, bled for, lost pieces of myself to earn. And instead of feeling proud, I felt empty. Because all I could think about was, who saw this? Who noticed? Who's going to tell me I'm good enough now? And that question, that brutal question, wrecked me. I had been building a life that looked so whole from the outside, but inside I was starving. Starving for a kind of belonging that applause could never fill. Starving for a sense of self that didn't vanish the second the spotlight moved on to someone else. I've learned something since then. I've learned that the real, grounded power comes when you no longer need to be seen to feel valuable. When you no longer need the room's attention to feel worthy of your own. Psychologists call this intrinsic validation. It's when your sense of worth is rooted inside you, not attached to the rise and fall of other people's opinions. It's not about arrogance. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about not needing to care. Because here's the quiet, overlooked truth. When you stop needing the spotlight, you become free to actually live. You stop playing to the crowd. You stop bending yourself into something palatable for people who never bothered to taste the real you. You stop trying to be loud just to avoid being left behind. The people who truly walk in their own power, they aren't the ones pushing to the front of the room, waving their hands, begging to be seen. They're the ones at peace in the back of the room, deeply connected to who they are, whether anyone else is looking or not. When you stop needing the spotlight, you realize that being unseen doesn't make you insignificant. It makes you solid. It makes you whole. You begin to understand that there's a sacred kind of power in walking quietly, in showing up without fanfare, in doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. And something wild happens. When you stop chasing attention, the right kind of people start paying attention. The ones who see you without needing to be told. The ones who value you not for your performance, but for your presence. You stop living to be impressive. You start living to be true. There's this soft but unshakable courage in knowing you can shine in your own world without ever stepping into theirs, that you can hold your own light. And that's when they won't see you coming, because you're no longer playing their game. You've built your own. So learn to act like you don't care, not because you've stopped loving, but because you've started choosing peace over performance, power over pleading, and yourself over the version of you they wanted to keep small. The ones who act like they don't care, they won't see you coming, because you were never playing their game to begin with.